All right, hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Vileeth and we are back once again with Lahori Talks. This time, the guest for our discussion is, of course, none other than Aleha Jehanzeb. Aleha, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm perfectly fine. How about you go ahead and give us a small introduction about yourself? I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people watching already know you, but, formalities are formalities, so why not?
Hi, everyone. My name is Aleha. I'm a parliamentary debater and public speaker. I would classify myself as a human rights activist, a feminist of sort, and not of sort, but like definitely. But also, I like talking about politics and international relations.
Mhm. All right, perfect. The fact that you said you like talking about international relations and politics definitely relates to what we're going to talk about today because the topic that we have chosen, obviously, is the situation of Kashmir under COVID-19. And I feel like this is something that was given a lot of light initially when the Modi government started with the lockdown, but then eventually the media just began to drift away, especially internationally, from the Kashmir conflict itself. And I feel like during these trying times, we definitely need to be discussing about it.
For
So,
sure.
keeping that in mind, I guess let's just get right into it. Firstly, I think what I want to talk about, keeping the virus aside entirely, is the new law that they passed, which was the domicile law, and sort of the suspect timing that they had of it. So, what's your sort of opinion on the law? And then maybe I'll add something later on.
So I definitely agree. I think, again, keeping all sorts of biases aside, the timing of it was actually pretty convenient because in August was when they repealed Article 370 or revoked it, and then recently when the entire world was more worried about COVID-19, when there wasn't as much media attention being given to the Kashmir issue, they suddenly just go forth with this domicile rights thing. And for those who don't know, essentially it gives individuals who have resided in Kashmir for about 15 years, who've studied there for about 7, or who've appeared in their O or A level exams from a Kashmiri high school in Kashmir, in Indian occupied Kashmir, as well as the children of government officials who've been posted in Kashmir for about 10 years. So those are army officers, soldiers, any one of the sort. It gives them permanent citizen status within Kashmir. I think one of the key things that everyone's really concerned about is how in Kashmir right now you don't really have much employment opportunities for the people who are living there. So for you to be granting permanent citizenship to anyone who fulfills this criteria and giving them a way to become a permanent citizen only makes it even more difficult for Muslims who are living in a country that doesn't respect them already. It just makes their life a lot more harder because definitely the Indians there who are local to that area or who are given a lot more preference by the government will also then be given preference in such a regard.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think another thing that I think some of the more specialists that were, sort of studying Kashmir were raising their concerns about was this term demographic change. Because I think something that a lot of people need to understand is that when you're giving people permanent status for, based on a criteria, a lot of people are going to start flooding into Kashmir. And so it's not a stretch to say that the way the population at the moment is in terms of its percentages of the people of a specific region or ethnicity, that can definitely change when a lot of people start flooding into the region of Kashmir from, let's say, India or other places. We saw, I think, our Prime Minister Imran Khan also sort of making similarities between this and the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and how there was a demographic change in Palestine as well, and maybe a similar thing would now happen into Kashmir. And I think that's definitely an implication of this new law that they passed, and they passed it at a time when the entire world would be focused on the COVID-19 virus, and we see that take into effect as well because we haven't seen the media report a lot about the domicile law. I mean, I'm sure not a lot of people would even be aware that this law was passed initially. So
Yeah, exactly.
that's something that we do need to keep in mind. Moving forward, now I think we're going to get into sort of what the debate was initially about, and that is the effect that Kashmir has, this virus, the effect that this virus is having on Kashmir itself. So I think firstly I wanna talk about the internet ban that the Modi government has on Kashmir and sort of what are going to be the implications of that. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about that initially?
Okay, so the internet ban is of sort right after they revoked Article 370, they also sent in military troops. This was around August 2019 and September 2019. They sent troops, military troops, as well as cutting down on the internet within Kashmir to be able to clamp down on the situation and make sure that there's not a lot of outcry. They also banned public settings and gatherings around the same time. So because of this, people in Kashmir are not able to access any form of internet that's not that's something higher than 2G, which means that people are unable to work from home. It means that the awareness that they're getting about COVID-19 is uh, well subpar to say like, and that's me
Hmm.
stretching it really because they don't have access to anything. I was reading this article who was by someone, a journalist from Kashmir, and they said load like a regular file, it will take you around 2 to 3 hours. And that's a
Yeah,
regular
no,
like two to
absolutely.
three page document. And that's insane because in such a time of crisis, when there's a high alert situation everywhere and when you're in a time crunch, you really need to get information fast. And this information could not just be the whereabouts of your family, it could be the situation of areas surrounding Kashmir. It could be Kashmir
Yeah,
calling
yeah,
for help to other countries and asking them for medical supplies or assistance,
absolutely.
especially when there's like a sudden surge in that outbreak. Or it could just be an individual's ability to stay at home and be the breadwinner in the family yet still, but not put their family and themselves at risk, which is something it's something we don't see happening right now, which is why people are still going to work, exposing themselves and other people to the virus because they just don't have any alternatives that exist. But it also harms students who are unable to study from home.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep,
So
yep.
it's like a completely horrendous situation. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think another thing that we need to understand is a lot of the medical personnel that are working inside Kashmir. I mean, information regarding the virus is changing every single day. We have
Exactly.
WHO giving new guidelines or giving new procedures that they need to adapt within their hospital settings to ensure that the patients can survive. And when someone who is in the medical profession and is treating patients which are suffering from COVID-19, he doesn't has access to what are the latest guidelines for the intensive care unit, or what are the latest medicines that the doctors are using to sort of control the symptoms. This
Exactly.
is information that is so valuable that it could basically mean the difference between life and death for those patients, and it's information that just isn't available to the Kashmiris.
Exactly. I mean, so I wanted to give an example. I think 2 to 3 days ago, the American government released a report regarding what the structure of the coronavirus was like in America. And the
Hmm.
Chinese officials who finally got access to that report said that this is completely unlike the virus that had spread within China, which means that it's constantly mutating. So the
Yeah,
vaccine that people
absolutely.
were using against malaria that they were now thinking would work against COVID-19 is now rendered useless, which means that you now need to start changing up the way you're treating these people in hospitals. You need to start putting them in even more isolation, giving them different types of intensive care. And I don't think people in Kashmir even have access to that information, like when they need to have it. It's usually later or delayed that they get access to those files and documents just because they don't have the ability to access them because they don't have the internet required to. And I just think that the right to know is something that the Indian government is taking away from them. And although they have been called out by the UN and even by the US Secretary of State, I haven't seen Modi take any action or even make a statement regarding this crisis. And it's absurd
Hmm.
that he's getting away with it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of Kashmiris themselves are also raising their voices that this is something that they definitely need in this sort of time. And I mean, speaking of the actions that the Modi government is taking, I think another question that comes to mind is whether any steps have been taken by the Indian government to ensure that Kashmir is even fit to deal with the pandemic in the first place. So, I mean, I don't know, what are your sort of thoughts on that? Like, is Kashmir fit to deal with such a pandemic, and has the government done anything to sort of help them?
I think, like before I get into the entire aspect of like Medicare and everything, I just want to talk about how this new Domicile Rights Act that they passed is actually really counterproductive or intuitive to the crisis at hand. Because when you allow such a large influx of people into
Yeah,
Kashmir
exactly,
and
exactly.
you
Yeah,
have
yeah.
crisis, like you have this virus that has already spread within India, then even if Kashmir was an area that was somewhat isolated and could curb that or like control the spread of virus within its like the boundaries that exist around it, when you have a sudden influx of people coming in from all over the country, that's when you have a surge in the virus in this area as well. So I just don't understand why he would pass something like this at such a crucial time, because it only means that you have more access to people who have traveled God knows where and have perhaps procured the virus as well. But otherwise, I just want to talk about, I think the geography of Kashmir is really important when it comes to assessing whether or not they're able to deal with it, because it's a valley within the Himalayan region. It means that you don't really have the ability, or the infrastructure isn't the best to be able to transport many goods to them. But otherwise, I was reading the WHO report, and the facts were, okay, currently the number of nurses that you need in Kashmir is around 3,193, and Kashmir is stuck at 1,290. So that's around 1,900 nurses short on what they need to be. And there's one doctor for 3,866 people in Kashmir, which is 4 times the amount recommended. So the WHO recommends that you should have one doctor per 1,000 people. This is close to like 4 times just that. So clearly not able to deal with it. They don't have the funds or the paramedics or the doctors to deal with it. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, no. First of all, no, that's a very fair point that you made regarding the domicile law and how making more people come into the region of Kashmir is just going to affect it even badly. So that's a very good point. Secondly, yeah, no, you're right when you're saying that the region isn't fit, and it's not just about nurses and doctors, which although is definitely a very major point. I mean, even if you talk about their equipment, right? I was reading an article. I think this was from the New Humanitarian, which was originally known as IRIN News, and this was founded by the UN during the Rwandan genocide, I think some 20 off years ago. And they were giving statistics regarding the medical equipment of Kashmir. And in that article, they wrote that there are only 97 ventilators in the entirety of the region of Indian occupied Kashmir. And I'm not exactly sure what the exact population of Kashmir is, but I think it's around 12 million. If I'm wrong, you can correct me. Is that correct?
It's close to that, yes.
Yeah, it's close to that. So, yeah, so 97 ventilators for 12 million people is that's a scary thought, to say the least. And I think the number of their cases are already maybe in the 80s, in the 90s. It's definitely 70 plus.
Yeah.
And these are publicly reported cases, by the way. So we don't know how many people haven't been tested for it, how many people haven't got the opportunity to get tested for it, how much the Indian government is hiding the number of actual cases within the region. So this is publicly reported statistics. And even within those 97 ventilators, we don't know how many of them are functional in the first place. So the actual number would most likely be a lot less than 97. And the same goes for the number of intensive care beds, which for some of the people watching, normal medical beds and intensive care beds are actually two different things. In the ICUs, which are the intensive care units, the beds that are used are what are known as intensive care beds. They have certain features that normal beds don't, just putting that out there in case you didn't know that. The number of intensive care beds that they had was only within the 80s. So keeping these two things in mind, considering that they don't have enough ventilators, they don't have enough beds, if these number of cases begin to rise to, let's say, even if it's just 10,000, and let's say just 5% of those people require the ventilators and actual medical support, there's just not going to be enough ventilators, because if you do the math, 5% of 10,000 is 500, and the number of ventilators are less than 90 even. So, keeping this in mind and keeping in mind the fact that there aren't enough medical personnel available for them, Kashmir definitely isn't fit to face the crisis that is definitely upon them. And I don't think the Modi government has done anything. Have you read anything about any of something like this?
I haven't read that they're doing anything yet. In fact, they were asking for help. Kashmir has turned to the international community, asking them to send supplies, to send in aid so that they can buy equipment at least. But there hasn't really been any response to this yet. Another thing that I thought was actually really pertinent was the issue of political prisoners within Kashmir. So the prisoners that have been taken in a lot of countries, what they've started to do recently with the recent pandemic is that they started to release their political prisoners for like some short period of time. So Iran has let go of 54,000 prisoners. China has sent around 300,000 workers, healthcare workers, to go deal with the crisis within prisons. But I haven't seen anything happening, especially in Indian occupied Kashmir, where recently you've seen so many people just being taken behind bars for even speaking out against the government or asking for their rights or anything of the sort, where you have so many, where prisons are just overflowing with people. I don't see how the prisons are being helped, either prison systems are being helped. If anything, I think India is just trying to keep the situation quiet and trying to establish their control within the region even now. And I don't think a surge of coronavirus within Kashmir, if I'm to be frank, would really harm the Indian government in any way or form. Because if anything, it just gives them, I mean, it's a very fascist approach that the Indian government has been taking overall. But I mean, it is a way for you to get rid of a population that, frankly, you don't really care about or have shown to not care about in the past. So if that's what their intentions are, then I think they're doing a great job at it by not caring about their population. But I mean, I just
Yeah,
don't
I mean,
understand how they plan on
yeah.
dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, this is just going to cement the belief of the people that are already seeing the fact that the Indian government doesn't care about Kashmir. And I think this is a prime example of this, that, they're suffering from a pandemic, the entire world is, and the Indians can definitely help the people within Kashmir, and they're not doing anything, they're not taking any steps whatsoever to sort of help them. But I think, okay, I think both of us have definitely established that the Modi government definitely isn't interested in helping the region of Kashmir. But I think one thing that we do need to talk about is what is, let's say Pakistan doing, or what is the rest of the world doing about this? So what's sort of your opinion regarding, some of the policies that maybe we've adopted regarding Kashmir and the rest of the world?
So regarding the COVID-19 issue, I haven't heard of any particular policies that we've adopted either in regards to Kashmir. Do you know of any?
Yeah, no, I don't know of any either. That's why I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit more.
I haven't heard anything myself, which is it's alarming, honestly, because and this is something that I have a problem with as well, as far as like our own patriotism is concerned. We do like to champion ourselves on being like the saviors of Kashmir, and I understand that we're not as bad as what India has done. Definitely, I mean, what the Modi government and the steps that they're taking. This is not just me trying to be patriotic. This is, I think, more of an objective critique of a government's policies and their stance. I do think that this
Hmm.
violation of human rights is something that it's absolutely abhorrent, and I do think that there needs to be some accountability. But at the same time, when we champion ourselves off of being the saviors of Kashmir, and we don't take adequate action towards what's happening in not just Kashmir but Gilgit-Baltistan regarding this crisis, where people, and even in the absence of this crisis, when they don't have access to proper healthcare facilities, then this is bound to happen. And when this crisis, so as far as I know, all of Kashmir is just equally as it's equally just as screwed. So it's not just
Hmm.
Indian occupied Kashmir being even more worse off. It's just, I've heard that Pakistani occupied Kashmir is just as bad because, again, because of the geography, because of Pakistan's lack of funds, we're just not able to send them the equipment that they need. So as far as I think the international community then needs to step in to do something. I haven't seen the UN do anything. I haven't seen the WHO take any action. I haven't seen like I hardly see any NGOs even within the areas that are wanting to donate to Kashmir and to the refugees that are living within the area, and even to the soldiers who are there across and over the line of control, who possibly are risking their life because the government is forcing them to be there. So I haven't seen any action being taken against these things. And what really hurts me is a lot of the students that we see nowadays who are about your age, my age, for this time for them is usually college app season, where on their college applications they're going to want to be something that I haven't seen real implementation of, because a lot of people I know have written about Kashmiri refugees and how they've wanted to help them and help that they've provided to them, but now when they really need this help, I just don't see anyone who's willing to step up to the task and offer them some form of relief.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. And I'm sort of glad that you mentioned the United Nations, during when you were talking about this entire situation, because I feel like the UN has had sort of a history of just ignoring the Kashmir conflict entirely. I mean, even now, like we saw them have, when the Modi government initially imposed a lockdown and they revoked the articles from their constitution, we saw them have a meeting, but it,
Exactly.
quite frankly, in the most honest words possible, it was one of the most useless meetings I have ever seen
Yeah, I
as far as the UN is concerned, because it was one behind closed doors. So we don't know what was actually discussed within there, except the delegates who went. We don't have a transcript of the speeches of the delegates like we
yeah,
usually do for some of the public meetings of the UN. And secondly, there was no resolution passed. I mean,
yeah,
what's the point of the Security Council holding a meeting when they're not going to pass a resolution that's binding? So
precisely.
because then India isn't forced to take any action and they can continue doing whatever they're doing. And this sort of just feels like the UN had to do it as a formality to show the world that, hey, we're still relevant, we're still doing things. And just to prove that fact, they basically held the meeting to maybe appease a few people temporarily, and then they moved on. Because previously, we haven't seen them essentially take any sort of meetings. I think this meeting was held after, I mean, this was after quite some time, I believe. The last meeting was, I think, in the 1900s. This is
Yeah.
perhaps, I think, the first one that was held in the 21st century. So yeah, um, it's very sad to see this, because I mean the UN. in terms of its charter, in terms of its resolutions, and all these massive international laws that it passes. It says that it stands for humanity, it stands for diplomacy in resolving situations. But then when it comes to conflicts like Kashmir, it seems as though the UN just opts to remain silent, if anything else. But
Exactly.
nonetheless, speaking of things that and action that people can do, I think one thing that we do need to discuss is, since the Modi government isn't going to do anything, and the UN most certainly doesn't seem like they're not going to do anything, what is us as individuals, like you and I, we students, the youth of the country, what is something that we can maybe do to make a difference, no matter how slight that difference might be?
Um, well, frankly, in at times of like COVID-19, I'm actually very unsure of the change that we can bring about. So, because a lot of the things, so when I was thinking about potential actions that we could take, a lot of them just got shot in the foot just because they don't have access to the same internet that we do. So any transaction
Hmm.
that we
Hmm.
want to give to them over the internet, such as like Easy Pesa or transferring some form of money to them, except with the lockdown, I don't even think transfer of money is possible except if it's online. और वो
Yeah.
online
Yeah.
कोई नहीं था क्योंकि उनके पास proper internet facilities ही नहीं है वहाँ पे. So then I was thinking about what if we can give them we can get in touch with the school and give them lessons over Zoom or something else. We can maybe take over as their teachers. But then I thought, okay, they don't have internet, so that's not going to work either. Um, frankly, I think one of the main things that we can do is maybe push our own government. And this can be done through various means. And I mean, speaking of us, we are the 1%, 2% elite of the country, which means that our ability to have connections and contacts is, in fact, very high. And I know a lot of people who are in contact with Imran Khan due to either a family basis or like he's a family friend or something of the sort. You
Hmm.
get in contact with them, you tell them that this is or you give them a lump sum, you say that this is the amount of money we're going to be collecting, and we want this money to be spent on purchasing XYZ equipments, and we want those equipments to be sent to Kashmir. We
Hmm.
might not have the money to or the ability to send resources there, but I'm pretty sure with a government that just needs an extra bit of push and a little bit more accountability, a little more transparency, I'm pretty sure that we can at least help out our side of Kashmir. Otherwise, I was in contact with a couple of students in India. I was thinking of starting an initiative a while ago. It was called the Humans of the Subcontinent. When the Modi government was starting, when they passed their citizenship amendment bill. And essentially, that was sort of a student union between students of both Pakistan and India, and they came together, and it was about protesting and revolting and pushing both governments to take the necessary actions required. So I was thinking maybe we could get in touch with those students in India once more and ask them what actions they think they could take for Kashmir and how they could hold their government to a bit more of a transparent stance. Because even if we can assume that Pakistan has good intentions towards Kashmir, I don't know if Modi does, and I don't know if the
Hmm.
BJP does either. So I don't know how they'd react to this pressure and to force ultimately.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I think that's correct as well. And what's sort of your opinion on maybe some of the influencers of within Pakistan, who have maybe a larger audience,
Mhm.
sort of maybe just raising their voice and sort of telling people to sort of rise up and maybe put a little bit more pressure towards the government. What's your opinion on this? Like, is that something that would be practical for them to do?
I think definitely it doesn't take much time for you to stand up and say, hey, people here are dying, maybe we should help them out. Especially because a lot of these
Yeah,
people are
yeah.
scared to raise their voices when it comes to people otherwise internationally. So when it was the Syrian war, so many people raised their voices against Bashar al-Assad and his government. When it was the United States and other human rights violations that they've caused across the world, let's say Guantanamo Bay, then you have people raise their voices as well against that. When it's the Uyghur Muslims in China, then you have people raise their voices regarding that. But when it's someone who's, I think it's within your own country or in the bordering state next to you, why is it that we're so hesitant to then speak out against it when we have the ability or the most amount of ability, let's say, to push our government to take action? Because these influencers, they don't just have local media coverage, they have international coverage in a lot of instances. They have the ability to manipulate government policy because they can give or get bills up to that level. They can shine light upon certain stances that the people might have. And at the end, I would like to think that a democracy is the people's will and the voice of the people. So if it is us who want something and are pushing for some sort of change, then I do think influencers focusing on that can catalyze our ability to get that change implemented. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree with you with that entire thing. And I think this is definitely something for our audience to perhaps ponder on is why is it that when it comes to Kashmir, people are so hesitant to sort of raise their voice? And that's a valid question. That's a very valid question that you asked. I think lastly, this was something that you definitely recommended when I was talking to you before we had the recording was it's important for us to discuss ways to cooperate between the Modi government and the government of Pakistan at the moment.
Hmm.
So, what's sort of your opinion on this, and how exactly do you think the two governments can come to an agreement and maybe begin some cooperation in helping the people of Kashmir?
Um, I think firstly, there are two things that, in my opinion, have, or three things rather, that have really divided Pakistan and India over the years. The first one would be the historical tensions that have, for some odd reason, just continued to exist today. So the three wars that we've had, the fact that the violence that was carried out by both the Muslim and the Hindu sides during, let's say, partition. I think that that hatred, that anger, is now being used by a lot of governments to um, seek election or seek office because they capitalize off that. So, for example, Modi within India did use a lot of anti-Muslim or anti-Pakistani rhetoric to get elected into office. Similarly,
Hmm.
there
Yeah,
are a
no,
lot
absolutely.
of who, when you have riots, etc., in Pakistan, or when you feel like you might not have the popular support, you start to use India as your source of negative cohesion of sort. हम इंडिया को खराब करके रख देंगे, हम उन्हें तबाह कर देंगे, and all of that, very hateful rhetoric. I think that only makes cooperation even more difficult. But secondly, I think because both of us are nuclear states, I think that only adds to the tensions. But thirdly, it's because I think we treat Kashmir as something that's to be gained or a property rather than an autonomous country or a city or a state in and of itself. So both Pakistan and India think that they are best suited to hold some significant portion of Kashmir. But if you think about it, that's exactly what the colonizers did to us some time ago when they thought it was okay for them to come into our country, okay for them to dictate the way we live without taking our opinions into consideration. And then finally, after I think close to like a century of colonization, we finally said, or no, more than a century of colonization, definitely, we said, okay, that's enough. Now we want our own separate state. I think it's very similar to what we're doing to Kashmir or what we did to Bangladesh, for instance, as well, where we did not consider their opinions. And I think, if anything, popular opinion does go to show that Kashmir needs to be autonomous, needs to have some degree of autonomy because the people, I don't think they want to be part of India. I don't even know if they want to be part of Pakistan. But that's where their voices get drowned out in our opinions of what should happen to Kashmir. So I do think that there needs to be just a little more humanization when they think of it as not something that's to be earned, as not someone's property, as people who are just as dignified as anyone else and who do deserve the same liberty that anyone else does have in the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think you're right when you're saying that, maybe the region of Kashmir, those people, they definitely need to be given a voice to decide what they want to do. I mean, historically speaking, every single time anyone's talked about self-determination in Kashmir, it's always just been shunned off as something that is unnecessary when that is entirely not true. So I completely agree with you there. And I guess we can all just, in general, try our best to raise our voice against this. And for the people who definitely have these connections, I do think that they should try to push our government, if anything, to sort of send some sort of aid, send equipment, send medical personnel into the region of Kashmir. And at the end of the day, I think all of us can just hope that the entire situation gets resolved as fast as possible, not only just for Kashmir, but I think worldwide as well. Anything else that you would like to add before we sort of finish off?
Other than, I would just like to say thank you so much for having me here, and I really do appreciate this youth-based discussion initiative that you and Lahori Talks have taken up. I think it's really essential in making people more informed and giving them an incentive to research about things. I think that's the first step to any form of change that can be achieved. So,
No, I mean,
great to see you.
hmm. But I would actually like to thank you instead because you definitely agreed to sort of come on as a guest and you took some time off of your schedule to help us in our small cause that we have here in hopes of, sort of informing the masses of what is happening as far as different conflicts of the world are concerned. But I think with that, we've done with the discussion. And I'd like to thank everyone who stuck around long enough. It's been, I think, almost 35 minutes to listen to the entire discussion in case you have. And if you're watching this on Facebook or Instagram and you're watching the small highlight reel that we post, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and head on over there because you're missing out on a lot of the key aspects of the discussion as it goes on. And so it's much better for you to watch the entire thing rather than just watch the small highlight reel. This is Waleed Ahmed. I was with Aleha Jehanzeb today. This has been Lahori Talks. Thank you so much for watching, everybody, and we'll see you all next time. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, Aleha, once again for coming.
Thanks.